Order, order. Good morning. On behalf of the committee, can I thank our first panel of witnesses this morning for coming along to give evidence to us. As ever, we have quite a lot of ground to cover, so as succinct answers as possible to enable us to get through what we need to. We do have another panel this morning, would be much appreciated. Can I welcome Nishma Patel, Chemicals Policy Director from the Chemical Industries Association, Steve Bates, Chief Executive of the Bioindustry Association, and Martin Sawer, Executive Director, Healthcare Distribution Association. Can I begin by asking you this question, and if you could answer it in a sentence, that would be quite helpful to kick us off. As you will be aware, at the moment there is a debate going on about what should happen on the 31st of October, and some of the people who wish to be the next Prime Minister are arguing that, if necessary, we should leave the European Union on the 31st of October without a deal, a no-deal Brexit. Could you just summarise for us what your reaction is to that suggestion? What would a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October mean to the businesses that you represent? Ms Patel.
Thank you. So a no-deal Brexit for the Chemical Industries Association, our messages have been consistent and the same as it is. It will mean that businesses will face continuous price rises and costs. There will be inefficiencies. The chemical industry is a just-in-time industry, so there will be an impact on getting material in and out of the country.
Okay, Mr Bates.
A disorderly no-deal Brexit will negatively impact patients, public health and the life science sector.
Okay, Mr Sawer.
As a trade association representing the distributors within the UK, we would expect medicine shortages and a lot of price rises for the NHS to happen pretty quickly, and some shortages in most constituencies around the UK for sure.
Right, okay. Now, can I start with medicines? Because we have, I think the public has learned during the course of the last 3 years a great deal about how cars are made and how the motor industry works, imports, just-in-time, just-in-sequence delivery. It'd be very helpful if you could just briefly, whichever you want to take this on, describe how medicines are made, supplied and distributed in the UK. I might, Mr Bates, if I start with you and then...
Yeah, thank you. So since 2016 we've worked with the ABPI on the core policy issues around this, and I'm going to oversimplify, so apologies for this, but if you think about supply chains for medicines, often they are regionally integrated, so you'll have a supply chain for America, perhaps one for Asia and one for Europe. You'll have an active pharmaceutical ingredient made in one place, perhaps the UK. That will then be formulated, put into a formulation perhaps in another place, perhaps Germany. That can then be put into a finished product and packed, so put in a pill packet in another place, and then that goes through a regulated process again of labelling, and then you'll go to a distribution hub which will then be distributed out. So there's many stages of manufacture. It's different for biological medicines, those ones which are often used for cancer in hospitals, because they're made very differently. But there are regulatory steps in every single one of those places, and there are trade and tariff implications, short and long term, in each one of those spaces. And changing any of this, because it is factories which are regulated by international regulators at speed, is very difficult. And the idea that the new things can be done in the timeframes we are looking at is impossible.
Impossible?
Building a regulated manufacturing process would take years. That does take years, and therefore we're looking at, I think, 130 odd days to the October deadline. Moving things at that pace is undoable.
Okay, now Mr Sawer.
So once the medicines, the finished product is in a big warehouse in the UK, it's called pre-wholesaling, where the manufacturer still has control and ownership of that product. They then release it to my members. My members are wholesalers and distributors. We represent 10 companies who distribute 2.5 billion packs of medicines a year through the 4 countries of the UK. The NHS is largely paying for this. The 10 companies have 54 warehouses around the UK, so the bigger warehouses send product to these smaller warehouses, which are local ones, so they can work in a region or a locality, because then 250,000 van deliveries a week go to all the pharmacies, all the doctors and all the hospitals in the UK, run by NHS and private sector. And they do that twice a day. So it's a just-in-time service. We're acting as the back room for the pharmacy, because pharmacies are small. They may have a stock for the patient who walks in, but they need the product again in the afternoon to replenish. So we do deliveries in the afternoon. So that is how the system works, and it is an integrated and flexible and resilient supply chain that has survived much. But if we don't get the product into the UK in the first place, then we've only got about 2 weeks stock in the wholesale sector, just so you know, that then can go to pharmacies and hospitals at any one time.
And perhaps a final point on scale. 45 million medicines packs are exported from the UK to the EU every month, and 37 million packs move from the EU to the UK.
Now, just on the 45 million packs that go from the UK to the EU, just picking up the point about testing, because at the moment you can make something in the UK, test it, and as long as it meets the EU standard, then it's free to be distributed throughout. The day after, am I right in thinking that the day after a no-deal Brexit, any testing done in the UK is no longer recognised by the other 27 member states?
So the European Medicines Agency, in terms of its ask of the regulatory position for pharmaceuticals, has been to ensure that QP release is done within the EU27, qualified person release is done within the EU27. Because there's been some time on this, most of the products that are on the market for the EU will have a QP legally available in the EU.
So
much
they've
of that has moved.
shifted that. But does that include the physical testing?
It doesn't include the physical testing. It's the QP release that is the thing that is that the EMA have asked for. I think that is largely there. I think the thing that perhaps it's important to understand is that if those trucks are going through Calais, the question as to how Calais works becomes a question, because it's not simply a QP release issue. You may have customs and other checks that are there. So I think that there are big challenges for EU patients. It depends a little on how the EU27 and France choose to operate the border. That would be my concern on that one.
Right. Now, Mr. Sawyer, you said there will be medicine shortages.
Yeah.
Now, that's a pretty serious statement to make. Now, the government has said we've done a lot of no-deal planning. We've asked people to hold 6-week stocks and so on and so forth. There's been a great deal of focus on medicines have a very, very short shelf life, maybe need to be held in temperature-controlled conditions. How extensive and what all sorts of medicines may result in shortages?
There are a lot of unknowns here. At any one time, there's about 100, 150 medicines currently every day that are in short supply. The supply chain works to try and fill those gaps. So you might go into a pharmacy and ask for or be prescribed a medicine, and they'll say come back the next day. Yeah. We can usually get most medicines within 24 hours because they may be in the wrong place. They may be in Newcastle when they should be in Southampton. They may be, there's a lot of patient conditions where there may only be 2,000 people in the UK require a medicine. There's things like motor neurone disease, the EpiPen issue last year, you probably recall. And if there's and the other challenge is there might be a global problem. There may only be manufactured in a couple of sites. There may be a regulatory issue. There may be a fire at a factory, or one may be closed down. We've had a lot of that. So there's shortages at any one time anyway. The thing is to overlay that on some products that might have a short shelf life. They may need to be refrigerated the whole time when they're coming across from the EU. 50% of the medicines in our warehouses have touched the EU at some point. Even though they may come from other countries outside of the EU. So it's about trying to overlay on top of what normally happens. We would expect some critical shortages probably in the lower volume medicines, not the everyday ones which are stockpiled very high. Some say that a manufacturer may only produce one product, and it may be that product which is for a small patient base, and it has to be managed very carefully. And the UK is not an expensive market; it's very cheap. If it's a generic product, not one on patent, we believe they're much more likely to be more volatile because they are dependent on prices. Unless prices go up, the medicine might not come to the UK. The manufacturers sometimes will not provide it to the UK if the prices are too low. Now,
does the NHS England Department of Health, do they accept that there will be medicine shortages when you talk to them?
I think accept is perhaps, I can't criticise the preparation that the department has done.
Okay.
The Department of Health and the NHS has done fantastic planning. We've been talking to them for a year, almost on a weekly basis. So they've done terrific. They've already set up a shortages team within the NHS since January. I think they've certainly, on the communications and the understanding of what might happen, they're right up there, and I have nothing to complain about. It's just that we don't know, and the challenge has been, like EpiPen last year, there was a factory that had a fire, and suddenly that was a front page issue, really serious. And it's only in medicines you have to get it 100% right. It's not like supermarket shelves or car parts, because you can delay that. You can't delay it for some critical medicines, so that's our concern.
I would echo Martin's points around the preparedness of NHS England. I think they have done a good job. The question that's difficult for us to understand is, beyond the normal level of stockouts and challenges within the supply chain, how much additional will there be from a BrExit challenge? And there's a whole host of new unknowns which sit within on top of an existing system, which I think does work robustly, knows how to cope with things like Christmas, where there are stock-ups and stock-downs, has worked through the London Olympics and the challenges of road shuttage and things like that. So there is some contingency. The question that's hard to judge is, what would that look like on top of that in a UK context?
Okay. Now, the government entered into some ferry contracts to provide additional transportation capacity across the channel, depending on delays. Those have now been finished. We're, as you said, 120 days. How important would new ferry capacity through new contracts be to trying to mitigate the risks that you've just been describing?
So they were fundamentally important as part of the planning for the last deadline. Where we were then, the government wrote to companies 113 days in advance, saying that border assumptions were being revised to a worse position, and companies were told to expect delays for up to 6 months on the short straits. Therefore, stockpile needed to be supplemented, and therefore they were working to ensure there was sufficient roll-on, roll-off freight capacity. Today, we're 134 days from a possible future deadline. As I understand it, the Conservative leadership contest result isn't due until the week commencing 22nd of July, so that would be 101 days to a possible no deal. We saw the challenges last time in the procurement and supply of additional ferry capacity to additional routes. It's getting very, very shortened terms, and we're getting less time this time, with no guidance as yet published to companies on what the plans are for ferries this time round.
Okay. Now, finally from me, Ms Patel, the government's done its long-term analysis of leaving the European Union, and the manufactured goods sector is estimated to be the most affected sector under a modelled no-deal scenario. And the government said that under that scenario, GVA for the chemicals, pharmaceuticals, rubber and plastics products sector will fall by over 20% compared with today. Now, is that an analysis that you share as the CIA?
Absolutely, and I think
you do. Now, right now, a 20% fall in GVA is pretty substantial amount.
Yes.
Is it not?
It is.
Yeah. So the sector looking at that and thinking about a no-deal Brexit says what?
I think at the moment the sector is doing all it can to plan for a no deal.
Right.
But the reality is, in all that preparedness and readiness in their planning, I don't think it's possible for them to implicate how no deal will plan out. So they will do all they can to make sure we have stockpiles in place.
Right.
Chemical manufacturing, chemical goods, not only do they go into some of the everyday essentials that Steve and Martin have talked about, and some of the critical national sectors here in the UK, but I think it's also important to recognise that the industry itself is its own biggest customer. So our goods will go to and from the European Union a number of times before it hits any other sector. So any sort of knock-on effect on that, whether it's delays at ports, whether it's getting goods across the UK, will have an impact on the sector itself before it even has an impact on the sectors that we provide into.
So how anxious are the chemical companies about a no-deal Brexit?
Anxious, they are very anxious, but I think they are doing all they can to prepare for a no deal. And talking to some of our companies at the moment, some of our members at the moment, they are very much looking at planning for no deal as much as they possibly can.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Jeremy Lefroy.
I just wanted to ask a question following up on from that, which arose from a comment made by somebody who gave evidence a couple of weeks ago, where they said that in terms of the chemical industry, there are companies which have plants particularly in the Netherlands, which are looking to increase their capacity because they see opportunities for moving production or taking production out of the UK to the Netherlands. Is that something which you've seen and which you've heard of, or is that not something you've come across?
We've heard some evidence of offices, plants being opened in other parts of the European Union to facilitate trade in the event of no deal. In terms of no deal, I think companies have pretty much, the way they've done their planning is highlighted the areas where they will need to take action. Some of those actions are reversible and some of those aren't. So opening a plant, for example, pretty much a non-reversible action. And the more uncertainty we've seen over the last coming months, the more we head towards a possible no deal in October. Those non-reversible actions are the ones that companies are starting to look to.
Have you got any specific examples of non-reversible actions that
Not with me at the moment today, sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Craig McKinley.
Yeah, thank you. Just to declare an interest, my wife's a community pharmacist. Mr. Sawyer, you said some fairly alarming things at the start there. I think you said there'll be shortages, price rises, they'll affect every constituency. I'm not entirely sure you've explained why. Let me just go back to a very brief basic. During the maximal fear campaign that was out there a few months ago, insulin was mentioned. And I know Denmark is a very big manufacturer of insulin. Are we really to believe that I don't know the insulin making company in Denmark, but I understand it's a big side of it. Are we really to believe that if we've got money to spend, and we are part of the WTO Pharmaceutical Tariff Elimination Agreement, which I don't think is beyond reality that we would be a part of, are we really to believe that the Danish insulin manufacturer would somehow not want to take our money to sell us the insulin that we need? Are we really to believe that? Because I find that somewhat fantastical. I know Brussels is a very powerful entity, but I don't think it would be able to influence that publicly quoted company upon which Danish pension funds are reliant would somehow be prevented from taking British money for a good we want to buy, and also working the other way. There must be a lot of British pharmaceutical products that are needed by EU citizens. Are we really to believe that we're going to enter some sort of nasty battle with each other to deprive each other's patients of what they need in pursuit of some political ambition? I just find this very difficult and a struggle to believe.
I don't think that example is realistic. We have months and months.
So that scare factor of insulin was rubbish from day one, was it?
Well, I wouldn't say it was rubbish. It was an example, and I don't know who used that example, because it was about manufacturers stockpiling, and I know insulin is stockpiled. We have months of insulin. The examples I mentioned in my introduction was smaller volume medicines that are needed by less patients, which are cheaper, and they're generic companies which they may be residing in companies the other side of the world that manufacture them for the whole world, and it's not a well-known product that is necessarily going to cause these problems, but it is a problem for some patients, and for one person, a medicine is personal, as you know, and that is the sort of product I'm talking about, and we don't know where that might lie, I'm afraid, and I don't think it's going to be in the insulin area for sure, because of exactly the reasons you've just said. I mean, that's a large.
I mean, I will but guess, but that fear factor on insulin must have come from one of your. Where did it come from?
Well,
it was out there.
The
BBC lapped it up for some weeks.
Perhaps I can give you the detail on this. So Novo Nordisk are the manufacturer.
Was it
Novo Nordisk is the company that manufacture. They're not publicly traded. They're owned by a foundation. They have a strong commitment to patients and a strong commitment to the diabetes community, and that will be their first priority. I know that it is. The supply chain for insulin, which is a biological medicine, doesn't at present come through the short straits, so wouldn't necessarily be affected by some of the challenges that we are seeing. I think that it's fair that there is we've been asked as an industry last time round to prepare, as part of our stockpiling, for 6 weeks additional buffer stock to that which is there. I think the question that was put and where this story arose was about indigenous capacity to make insulin and how much of it we've got in the UK if we were going to go to a position where we had challenges on trade. There is little capacity in the UK to build an insulin factory, and there is very limited capacity in the UK to have the insulin supply that's needed for all type 1 diabetics rapidly developed in the UK. So I think you're confusing, in a sense, a question about trade with a question that was put about about the ability to do this within the country, which I think is where that story arose from. I think the other question, and thank you for raising the WTO tariff arrangements. We have asked the government to ensure that the WTO pharma tariffs, 0 for 0 tariffs, which is a voluntary agreement, will be maintained. Of course, they've not been updated since 2010, so any of the new products that have developed, or the ingredients for those new products since 2010, which is 9 years ago, are not covered by this agreement. It's a voluntary agreement, and many of the elements that go into the manufacture of pharmaceuticals when they are made here, such as bioprocessing bags, so the way that biologics are made in the UK is you put them in, often you make them in bioreactors which are lined with a very large plastic bag. They are not covered by issues such as the pharmaceutical tariff. So you've got to get into the detail of this for an understanding of both what operating under WTO would look like. And of course, I was very concerned to see Liam Fox say that he could see that urgent and drastic action must be taken to protect the global trading system, and he could see the WTO being in an existential crisis by Christmas last week, and we've not yet heard detail, if we were to be in a no deal, how that would operate if the appellate court wasn't operating by the turn of the year.
I believe the temporary tariffs that we published in March does cover most of these products. So
that's 6.5% on bioprocessing bags, not 0%.
I mean, I'm not familiar with all the inter-country deals. There must be inter-country deals working around this world.
Well, of course, the question here on rules of origin, you're right to go to, because in complex manufacturing processes like biologics or pharmaceuticals, there is a big step between the rules of origin as to how they operate, and trying to break out that in an integrated supply chain where you have different steps and different levels of manufacturing complexity leads to an impact on the tariff levels. And if you have a part of that that's in the UK and a part of that, so you've got the pill packaging in the Netherlands and perhaps the API in the UK, the implications of that for the tariffs to Indonesia are dependent on the mix of those two things. So you're right to get to the detail. And again, for us to operate as businesses and for people to make investments, they need certainty on these things, and there is not clarity on the detail issues of these things.
Can you perhaps help? I was going to move on to, there must be a lot of inter-country agreements on mutual recognition, on licensing. Let me just pluck Israel out the air. Big pharmaceutical producing country, well respected, and I'm sure in many things that we take on a daily basis have an origination in Israel. How have they managed to actually overcome these barriers that you say Britain would overcome as a normal independent country? How does Israel manage it? And then on the other hand, there must be Israeli patients benefit from EU medicines, UK medicines, US ones, wherever. They obviously overcome those supply chains, the just-in-time processing, all of those complications to supply their medicine to themselves for their patients. These things must be overcomeable on inter-country bilateral deals. Can you explain how that sort of works? I wouldn't expect you to understand the full integration of this in Israel, but it's an example of an advanced manufacturing economy that seems to survive.
So a few points. We've led a very successful trade mission to Israel, as we have to China and the US recently. And if you look at the UK biotech sector, it raised a record £2.2 billion. We are out there trading with the world, taking great British innovation to global markets. I think that if you look at Israel as a place for patients, what you see in terms of regulated products is that global companies tend to go to the key markets first. So they would launch a product in the US first, often then in Europe, the two big markets, increasingly China and Japan. Israel, although it's a small market, would come several years later, because the way it works is you've got one regulatory team, you aim at the big ones, and then you come to those, if you like, in the second division. So I believe that Israeli patients probably, and I'm no expert on Israel, Israeli regulation, Switzerland I could have a crack at, but Israel less so, will come in later in the launch sequence, so they'll get new products later, so later than NHS patients get them at present in terms of regulation. So that would be my point number one. Israeli companies trading would operate within a European context. They'd get their product regulated at a European level, and they would distribute into the European market. I think the question for us is, and we've seen some of this concern from Japanese companies as well as other companies, where would they put the UK outside the UK outside the EU in their thinking? And my view is it's more likely that the UK would become a second division market in the way that it's a small market, less than 3% of the world's market by value. So it's likely that it will go down the priority list. It's hard to know. We don't know. We're back for the UK to continue to be and patients to get access. But my judgment is that it will probably drop out of that top league, which is America, Europe, China.
Okay. And just very finally, brief. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just to build on that. Actually, you choose a good example because a large Israeli manufacturer has a European distribution hub in this country. And if we're not aligned in a regulatory standard for QP release and everything with the rest of the EU, then there's a chance that hub would have to move if we weren't part of the EU system.
And just finally, brief one for you, Mr. Patel, if I may. You said there'd be a loss of 20% GVA potentially of many chemical sales and value added to the country. I'm just intrigued, where are the EU going to buy this stuff instead in the short term? You know, it doesn't just disappear. The demand for all that stuff doesn't just disappear. Where are they going to buy it? Are they going to substitute buying it from the UK to another non-EU country? Because they couldn't scale up overnight to produce this stuff themselves. So I find it a very odd figure. It comes down to basics. I've got something I want to sell. It's the right price and the right quality. I don't frankly care where it comes from. That transaction happens. This is where I'm struggling with a lot of these arguments that are put forward.
And you're right, there will be key chemicals or key components which are UK are perhaps the only country that are supplying it, or that are the most competitive supplier at the moment. But the EU have the EU 27 member states to look for alternative sources, and we're already seeing some of that, particularly when you're looking at the regulatory part of the impact that EU exit is having, and knowing that there are going to be two duplications of regulations and the additional costs that will come attached to that. There are companies that are now looking at in the EU to say, well, we don't know what's going to happen, there is uncertainty. Where can I alternatively source products from within the EU, or perhaps from around the vicinity? So that's the worry, that the additional costs that will come with it and the additional time to get products to the EU, along with the documentation, is pushing EU customers to perhaps look elsewhere as an alternative.
I'm trying to think, the French buyer, if you can buy a similar product in Slovakia as you can in the UK, why are you buying it from the UK? Because the quality is right and the price is right. Are we really to say this is all down to a bureaucratic problem? Is the problem that we're facing, rather than one of supply and quality? It seems like the paperwork and the bureaucracy is the barrier here, rather than any common sense.
It's paperwork, bureaucracy, but it's also the additional cost
I understand that.
and the certainty of being able to have that product in time for that onward supply.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, we're a just-in-time industry. Things come in, they're there maybe a week or so, 2 weeks, and then they move back out. They come in, they move out. So if that is impacted, these are processes that are ongoing within manufacturing sites. You can't just put a stop to it and press a button and say, well, that's it, we won't manufacture because we haven't got our raw materials in, because of the nature of the products that we deal with. So that is a big risk to companies, and it's a big risk at the board level.
And the paperwork and bureaucracy in medicines, of course, is there for patient safety purposes. That is the core point of this. We're happy to operate in a regulated industry, and we think that we should do no less because of the security for patients.
Thank you.
Mr. Bates, you said a moment ago that you thought the UK might, in terms of pharmaceuticals, move into the second division. Now, Does that mean, given the example you referred to of Israel, new medicine is developed, say, in the States, the company has to decide where to go to get it approved. There'll be the European approval process through the EMA. The UK in a no-deal Brexit will have to establish its own approval process. The European market is that size and the UK market is this size. Is it your judgment that that means that that new medicine is more likely to get to patients in the 27 member states first before it comes to patients in the UK second?
Yes, we're working hard for that not to happen, but that is my judgment.
That's your judgment. Of course you can. Sammy Wilson.
You were saying that the real cost may be the paperwork and the delays which that would cause because of different regulations, and that's what may persuade chemical companies and others to look elsewhere in the European Union for their supplies. But we're asking about a no-deal Brexit and what would happen immediately after the 31st of October. Given that the regulations which pertain to the UK chemical industry at present are the same as regulations which pertain in the rest of Europe at present, that we have adopted all of the European regulations when we did the legislation here in Britain, why would there be that additional paperwork? I can understand why there might be additional paperwork once regulations diverge, but why would there be an immediate impact if we had a no deal in October?
Yeah. So one of the big pieces of regulation that affect our industry is the REACH regulation, and it's about, essentially in a nutshell, if I can explain, having a license to market. So most manufacturing or importing companies in the EU complete a registration, and it's about giving the data on chemicals, whether it's safe to use and so on, and in return you get a license to market within the EU. You can manufacture and import. In a no deal, EU REACH, the REACH regulations, does not apply to UK manufacturers any longer. The UK government has no longer any access to the European Chemicals Agency database, which holds the information on chemicals. So essentially, UK are pretty much starting from scratch. And you're right, we do have provisions in place to have a replicative regulation UK REACH at the moment, and the statutory instruments for that has passed. The problem is that the database is no longer there. The UK chemical industry has no data, well, at the moment has no data, and has not provided this to the UK government to regulate chemicals and to ensure the safety of consumers and the environment. So essentially, UK chemical companies will pretty much, there are transition provisions in place, but pretty much we're starting from scratch to provide that information again to UK government to build that database, and there is a very hefty cost attached to that.
Perhaps I can pick up on this. There's similarities in the European Medicines Agency work, and there's a reason why in the political declaration the chemicals regulator and the medicines regulator were put into a particular bucket. The point about data is very, very important in our sector. It's about pharmacovigilance data, which is the safety data that goes if something is perceived as being awry that needs to go into, they're then to be regulators to have a judgment on the pharmacovigilance issue, and then they have to work out whether they need to put extra warnings on, recall a product and such like. If there was to be a no-deal Brexit, the data flows would stop. The UK judgment would not be able to be based on information that would come from formally from regulators outside the UK, and the UK data, which is excellent in terms of the yellow card system operated by the MHRA, would not be available to Europeans. And if I can take you back a long time, if I may, one of the reasons why there was sharing of this data developed across the European, before the European Union, was because of the thalidomide challenge, where essentially problems were spotted in one country, and but thalidomide continued to be prescribed for a period of time in another country, and it's the sharing of that data that enables patient safety rapidly, enabling judgments to happen fast. That would be something that we wouldn't be able to do, and that's a particular challenge if you end up with regulatory divergence across the border, north and south, in the island of Ireland, where under Section 2 of the Belfast Agreement, you'll know that there are elements of health where patients go to one place to be treated and then return home, perhaps with prescribed medicines.
Okay. If I could just bring that to life, if that's okay, Chairman.
Please.
In terms of packs of medicines, on the 9th of February this year, every single pack of medicine put on the market in the EU 28 countries has to have a unique barcode, including the UK. If we leave with no deal, we could be unplugged from that system, and therefore medicines in the UK, we believe, will be less safe, because there's evidence already of organised crime trying to get into regular prescription market, and they've already picked up some packets through this new system in Holland, which often comes to the UK. So that system, the Falsified Medicines Directive, which came into law in this country in February, we could be unplugged from that on the 1st of November. And therefore, because we have no access to the EU database, that is based throughout the 28 countries.
How would a counterfeit medicine get into the supply chain that you described earlier?
Yes, often because they could be stolen products that come from other parts of the world that get into the supply chain through trade, through different trading mechanisms. And they're picked up through the database because the manufacturer has either alerted the fact to the database that have been stolen, and that every medicine has to be scanned before dispensing since February this year, because every unique barcode has been put on a database, which is a Europe-wide database.
So you're
be unplugged.
Differentiating between stolen and substandard.
Yeah, can do both. Yeah.
And it could be both.
Yeah, because if you're trying to put a counterfeit into the supply chain, that barcode will not be uploaded in the database. So as soon as you try to scan it, it would say it's not recognised and you don't dispense it.
But for the system to work, when you scan the barcode in the pharmacy, it needs to go back to a database and then get a response from the database as to whether it's good or not. If you're cut off from that database, the scanning doesn't do anything.
It'll say don't dispense.
It's got to go into the system to be able to say yay or nay. And if you're cut off from the system, all that work that's been done on putting barcodes in, the pharmacists have put the work in and getting this stuff into practice, won't work.
The base when we've got data arrangements with the EU, when they already know that our data systems are compliant with EU compliant systems, when it'll be in their interest to make sure as well the flow of drugs, safe flow of drugs. Why would they cut us off from that database?
Well, it's the European Commission has advised that we would be treated as a third country in the event of a no deal, and therefore there's no exchange of data covering all sectors.
Even though they know that our system of gathering data is compliant with, because we've been part of the whole system up to now, is compliant with the EU system, and even though we've already got agreements on data exchange.
The data for this particular system is one way. It only comes from the central hub, which is run by the EU. We get the data for the UK from them. We don't generate our own data.
But we're strong in the argument that a no-deal Brexit would have significant disadvantages to citizens within the EU 27 as well as in the UK, and this is a good example of that one as well.
Okay. Now, can I bring in Stephen Timms, or was this on this very point? Just briefly, yes, sure.
It's all about. I was just going to make that point, Mr. Bates, or ask about that. That presumably pharmaceuticals manufactured in the UK currently have this universal barcode that's recognised throughout the EU. And what we're saying is that would that barcode be recognised if those medicines were exported to the EU?
No, they would not. They would not, because the manufacturer the manufacturer puts the barcodes on a central hub based on the fact that they're QP released it's actually the EEA countries. So Norway's included, Iceland, Liechtenstein, but the UK at the moment doesn't. Well, we don't know in the event of a no deal what the relationship is with the EU. So the manufacturer's codes would be irrelevant in this instance.
So would that bring to an end export of medicines from the UK to the EU? No. These 45 million packs a month. In which case, how would they be barcoded?
Okay, what happens is the UK would be treated as a third country, and we would, as long as, depending on what the future trading arrangements would be, then the EU would recognise the UK in a new way, and if those products are then to be put onto the EU market, they would still have to have a barcode that the manufacturer at the point of going into the EU 27 would put the code on for the EU 27. It would be irrelevant for the UK market, but they have to apply them, you're quite right, for the EU 27
What I'm talking about is the 31st of October, if there is no deal, which heaven help us, I hope, if there is. then all the medicines, the 45 million packs a month that will be going in November, presumably will simply not be recognised in the EU. Therefore, immediately there will be a problem with medicines going into the EU unless somehow a new system of barcoding is attached to those from the 1st of November that is... I've obviously misunderstood it.
I'm no expert on this area, and if I may write to the chair on this point afterwards.
Will you do that?
Yeah.
Because it strikes me that this is a major point, that if those barcodes are no longer recognised, as Mr Bates, you rightly said, both ways, clearly a big problem for us, but also a big problem for the 45 million packs, which is a great...
My understanding is that the packs that are produced globally that go into the European market, because there will be producers from India, America and others that are operating into the EU market, it's part of I think the QP release system, and the EU are confident that having moved the QP into the EU 27, that they will be able to use that to say, okay, you've guaranteed that this is a legitimate product against the Falsified Medicines Directive, and they will use the QP as the point to ensure that. And if those QPs are resident within the EU 27, therefore legally liable within the EU 27, they will enable that to continue. So I don't think that that's the case, and I think they've done a workaround for that. The challenge for us on this one is that the UK will not be able to draw down the data from within the European Union. That's the concern. So it's a one-way challenge. They've already done the piece the other way round. But I will write to you on this.
If you would, that would be extremely helpful. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Patel, can I ask you about something you said to the Environmental Audit Committee last December, when you said that no deal would have catastrophic effects on the chemicals industry here in the UK. Now, you haven't used that phrase to us this morning. Is that because lots of planning has been done over the last 6 months and has eased the potential impact on the chemicals industry, or is it still your view that it'll be catastrophic?
It's one of those cases where you should choose your words carefully. I still do think that the no-deal impacts on the industry are likely to have profound effects on the industry, and we've mentioned some of those today. That's not to say since the time I give evidence in December, at the time, the information available, the preparedness at that time was obviously less than what we have here today. We've had two EU exit leaving dates, if you like, so there's been, an intensified preparedness leading up to those deadlines. The impact doesn't change. It's just that the preparedness, the understanding of what no deal will mean, particularly in terms of regulations. These regulations are complex, and it impacts businesses that perhaps had nothing to do with those regulations at the moment. They weren't caught up by, for example, the REACH regulation and putting into registration. So the awareness is higher. It's about the implications and the impact that I reckon will still be the same.
It sounds as though you're not now expecting it to be a catastrophe. Is that right?
I'd say there'll be profound impacts to the industry on a no-deal impact.
Yeah, I mean, profound impact isn't the same as a catastrophic impact. That's what I'm trying to understand what you're telling us.
There'll be negative impacts to the industry, particularly in terms of costs.
Okay. Your association was initially quite sceptical about REACH when it was being developed as kind of overly bureaucratic and intrusive and so on. And we understand the industry has kind of got used to it and accepted it. But is there now in the UK chemicals industry an appetite for doing something a bit different in the future to REACH?
Yeah. You're right. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, industry was not very keen on the regulation because of the cost and the administrative burden it brings. 10 years on, there has been a huge amount of investment and there are a huge amount of benefits to industry itself, to the regulation and what has been done to date. If we're looking at opportunities, what we hear from our members anecdotally is that if there are any benefits from doing something else, they far outweighed by the disadvantages of doing something differently. On top of that, if we also look at other global economies, and particularly where the chemical industry is quite significant in terms of its footprint, most of those, with the exception of the US, I guess, are looking to or already have implemented a REACH-like legislation. So it would not really make much sense for the UK to diverge or do something different to that.
So there isn't really an appetite now for doing anything different?
No.
No, okay. You've said previously, and you've touched on this already this morning, that with UK REACH, as now proposed, there was a need for more clarity about what the government had in mind. Has that clarity now been provided?
Yes, I think the information available from government has improved significantly, and the engagement and stakeholder engagement with businesses across the board has. My only comment on that would be, and I've mentioned it before, is there are a whole host of companies out there who have not been involved with the regulation, and these are particularly companies who are, say, using mixtures or putting together formulations with it before it goes into additional sectors. Those companies perhaps have no idea that they're going to be stung by the UK REACH regulation, needing to put in a registration, which not only takes time, but there's a big cost implication to that. So that would be my only sort of comment, to say there needs to be a wider stakeholder engagement to make sure everyone in the supply chain is aware of their obligations under a no deal.
So that's potentially a big challenge for quite a lot of companies. I mean, how can that be overcome? Or plus, I don't quite understand, how is it that companies making things in the UK don't have access to the registration data for those products?
So the registration process, essentially how it works is, it's at the moment, it's one substance, one registration. So whether you're a company in the UK, Germany, France, and you're making the same substance or importing the same substance or a similar substance, it's one registration. And the objective behind that is to minimise testing, particularly animal testing. So you're sharing data, and this is all done under commercial negotiations. There's one data holder, perhaps not the UK company, and they essentially get a letter of access to use that data for their registration for EU REACH purposes. So with UK REACH being in place, to dissect that data, take it back out, there will need to be a further negotiation on that data, and perhaps a commercial advantage to that EU data holder, or anywhere else in the world for that case, to perhaps charge more to the UK company to access that data and use it to submit to the UK, under UK REACH, for a UK chemicals database.
Right. So that could mean that companies just haven't got the information they need in order to register with UK REACH.
As it currently stands, no, they will be either starting to look at or re-entering renegotiations where they are already part of a registration, if you like. And those companies who are relying on the EU suppliers registration will have to do a complete new registration here in the UK. So these are the downstream users, if you like, of chemicals. Okay. And for those companies, it will be starting from scratch to negotiate access to that data.
Okay. Just one more question for me, Chair. And this is a question to each of the panel. How would each of your sectors be affected if the UK exited the EU without a deal, and in particular without a data adequacy determination from the EU, so that we could carry on exchanging personal data as we do at the moment?
Well, I think we've talked about two particular areas. One is pharmacovigilance data, the importance of that being shared at the moment through a centralised system, which is about patient safety data and the ability at speed to be able to make a determination if there's any concerns. So that would be one that would be significantly compromised and probably mean much slower decision-making processes. And the second, as we talked about, is falsified medicines directive. The third area for us that has big lack of clarity is clinical trials and clinical trials databases, how that would operate. And again, those are areas, particularly in rare diseases, where clinical trial data flows to and from a number of clinical trial sites within the EU. It goes into, we hope, into the new database that will be established by the new clinical trials regulation. So those would be three areas: pharmacovigilance, falsified medicines, and clinical trials.
So would UK participation, continued participation in European clinical trials, require a data adequacy determination from the EU?
I believe so.
Thank you.
The pharmacovigilance is important to us because we get information through the MHRA from the EMA about recall of products that might be, may be a problem with for whatever reason, and we have to immediately take all the products from that particular batch back from all the pharmacies in the UK, and that can happen immediately within hours to avoid them getting to patients, and then we quarantine them and we'll arrange a refund and reimbursement through the manufacturing process. But it's very important that speed saves and helps patients. And the FMD we've already touched on, but I'd also mention that three largest UK wholesalers and distributors are actually pan-European. So I imagine they act in an integrated way on stock issues. So the transfer of data about that may well add costs into their business, depending on what the impact is on data flows if we have a no-deal Brexit.
Okay. And Ms Patel, data issues?
If we have no data, essentially we lose a marketplace. We need the data to register under UK REACH. If that's not there, we lose the marketplace. Most of our members, 70% of them, are globally headquartered. They already have registrations in the EU for the EU27 marketplace. If that's not cost efficient or worth getting for the UK, we lose a marketplace.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Pat McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quite a lot this morning we've been talking about what might happen. I'd like to ask you about a decision that's already been made, especially Mr. Bates and Mr. Sawyer, which is the loss to the UK of the European Medicines Agency. What has been the impact of that, and what will be the impact of that going forward?
So the European Medicines Agency have put out management data recently. They estimate that they've lost between 20 and 25% of their overall workforce, won't be able to reach full staff levels for some time. 312 of their 776 staff members are still working from London as of June the 1st, so their plan to move to Amsterdam is in process but not complete. I think the main impact of that is twofold. One is it is meaning that the European Medicines Agency itself has had to jettison some projects and some work in order to focus on being able to do the core of its work, and this means things that could help the development of the latest innovative products in which the UK has a lead, like cell and gene therapy. Some of that work isn't being done, so Europe is going slower as a result of this change. And I think we are seeing some sense in which global companies are looking at the European Medicines Agency's hub in Amsterdam and the possibility of locating within the EU27. These are slow processes, going into their planning thinking for 2020, 2021.
I think specifically we as the association work very closely with our regulator, the MHRA, on good distribution practice, which is an EU-wide quality and regulatory system for distribution of medicines. The MHRA had a very close relationship with the EMA in the UK, in Canary Wharf, and was doing a lot of that work, I know. Therefore, I think the relevance, shall I say, of keeping regulations up to date in the UK and the weight that UK business inputted into those GDP regulations will decline. And I think that because of that relationship the MHRA had with the EMA, so I think actually over time it's quite significant because the MHRA is a very well-respected organisation within European regulators, and I guess they've lost that foothold.
One other point, the EMA have completed the transfer of rapporteurships, the leading decision-making on drug files for new drugs from the MHRA, so that the UK, which used to do quite a significant amount of this work, particularly in some of the most novel areas where the UK's life science industry is really at the cutting edge, those dossiers have been transferred in preparation for Brexit to other regulators, other national regulators in other parts of Europe, which means that it's difficult for MHRA staff in those areas to have to keep up with some of this in the way that they have been leading for a decade.
I'd like to turn to something else now, which is a report in the FT from it was reported last week, but it reported a government paper from a month or two ago, which set out the state of preparations for a no-deal exit for the chemical and pharmaceutical sectors. And the note said the government needs 6 to 8 months of engagement with the pharma sector to ensure adequate arrangements are in place to build stockpiles of medicine by October 31st. It also said it would take at least 4 to 5 months to improve trader readiness for any new border checks that might be required. What is your view of that paper? What is your view of the state of readiness now compared to the run-up to March the 29th? Are we more certain now, or are we still very uncertain?
If I can handle the first section about stockpiling in the UK and readiness, we have had that engagement. You know, the preparation, as I say, started a year ago. So certainly from our perspective, and I represent some of the pre-wholesalers who store and stockpile a lot of the manufacturer's products currently, because it's, as I said, it's under manufacturer ownership, which is important. That is still in place and has been, and we've been asked to maintain those stockpiles because of the dates moving from March, April now to October. So that preparedness on the stockpiles, I'm confident, is being maintained in the large. We will find, I'm sure, that there will be there's several things. The stock needs to be rotated to make sure it doesn't get out of date. You know, there's a 6-month difference, so we need to make sure that the older stock moves out and newer stock comes in. And for smaller manufacturers, and again, not the household names, but for smaller manufacturers, that is going to be a challenge financially. The private sector is paying for all of this, just largely anyway, in terms of stockpiling. So I'm worried about that. The second thing I'm worried about is that October is a time when there's more pressure on warehouse space across different sectors because Christmas is coming up. For us, it's a very busy time of year because you need more medicines over the Christmas period. So we start our own stock build at that time of year, and other sectors do as well because of Christmas. So the warehousing capacity in the UK will come under pressure in October in a way it didn't do in March for other sectors as well. So that is a concern. And I think in terms of keeping our eye on the ball, I know the department is keen to make sure that monitoring of stockpiles continues. So I'm confident that that will happen and that we will be in a reasonable place in the pharma sector for that, as I say, with those two other caveats I've just mentioned.
We've heard this point about Christmas in October from a few different sectors.
Oh,
you're telling us, don't think that you can just fast forward 6 months and everything with warehousing space is the same
Correct.
in October as it is in March.
Very much so, yes, correct.
Do you think there's also a potential cry wolf effect on preparing for a no-deal Brexit in October? Because we have heard from other sectors, well, we were told to spend a lot of money in the run-up to March, and then maybe it was going to be June. Here we go for the third time. Is your view that the sector will be just as tooled up, just as keyed up in October as it would have been in the earlier deadlines?
I think you're right to identify corporate fatigue as an issue, and I think it's important that my ask, if you like, for government would to keep the communications going, make sure they explain what is going on and monitor what is going on. But I agree, there are some smaller companies for sure who may think, yes, third time, why should we carry on because it's such a cost to our business? We'll take a risk of not stockpiling or decreasing the stock. Other parts of the world, I've discovered since the stockpiles were built up, suffered from a lack of medicines because they were all in the UK. So some manufacturers will be taking them out, trying to supply the rest of the rest of the world, and then we'll start stockpiling again in September. So there's that risk that might not be there in time, or that sort of thing.
Say a bit more about that stockpiling in the UK has caused shortages elsewhere in the world?
It's caused manufacturers to be concerned that the other parts of the world are not getting medicines quick enough. I'm not saying it's causing shortages, but I know that they have diverted stock, of some of them, out of the UK to fulfil other international orders from the stockpiles, but they're hoping to build them up again before October.
Okay.
So I think our industry is very cognizant of the fact that patients are at the end of our supply chain, and that in the sense has been the defining thinking behind what industry has been working towards for a number of years. We've been working for at least 2 years on the possibilities of no deal Brexit, and last time round, by about August, we had a reasonable, clear roadmap of what might be happening, both in terms of regulatory environment and something towards the shape of what might be happening at the borders. This time, we are much more compressed in the time frame, and it was interesting to see in that FT article. The new context for us, we work in a number of areas where there are risks: clinical risk, scientific risk, financial risk, political risk. Here, the political risk is up because it's very, very uncertain as to what a new Prime Minister, a new government might want to do in this space, and we're doing that in real time. And the thing that's concerning to me from the story from the FT is that you have a number of candidates in the leadership election who are privy to information within government. You have some that aren't, yet all are making promises around no deal, some with and some, and I don't know whether they're doing that with the best information. My plea is that that information is put not only before all the leadership candidates, but also industry, so that we can tell you what is expected of us and what we can do, but also MPs, because at some point the new leader of the Conservative Party will seek to form a government, and that should be based on the best information about what is practicable. So I would think that there's a good reason for that to come out. I wasn't sure at the end whether you said we were very uncertain or very uncertain. I'm certainly very uncertain about ferries, and that is a real challenge because that was a crucial part of the planning last time round.
If you think the government's been burned by the chaos over the ferry contracts that took place in the run-up to March, and a company that had no ferries and so on, what is it, from your point of view, that you need to be in place that you don't think is in place now on that transport issue?
I think from my perspective, one of the things that we've discovered through the work is the vital importance of the flow rates in the short straits. That's the Dover-Calais Euro tunnel area for just-in-time supply. The work around last time was to have alternative routes with ferry capacity on that. There's a big difference between having roll-on, roll-off capacity, where the drivers stay in the trucks and roll it on, or you leave the back of the truck, the container on, and then you have another cab pull it off at the other end, particularly for temperature-controlled medicines, which need to stay within a regulatory framework to make sure that they're compliant and stay within the temperature so that they can be actively used. This is beyond the control, I believe, of the Department of Health, but we've seen the retirement of the lead official from the Borders Delivery Group announced in recent times. I see that some candidates are saying that it's only responsible to prepare vigorously and seriously for a no-deal Brexit scenario. I suppose my question is, with 134 days to go to this possible thing, I'm not seeing visibly, in terms of clear direction to industry, clear and visible data. And you also mentioned that the point about trader readiness. There is quite a lot of work that needs to be done, particularly for supply chains and people who drive trucks. They are big companies and small companies too, to make sure that you've got all the paperwork together. And if you're going to be flagged and pulled at the border, either in Dover or Calais, because you haven't got all your paperwork together, that really has an impact on how quickly the lorries go through. And that, I think, needs time to bed in, because that's not something that people are going to easily do overnight.
And that's because some of this stuff can't be stockpiled. I mean, Mr. Sawyer told us that we've got warehouses full of drugs, which may be having an impact elsewhere in the world, I don't know. But the point about some of these medicines, you mentioned this phrase, just-in-time supply. If you could just spell it out for us a bit more. Some of this can't be stockpiled, can it? It's a case from manufacture to use within a very short period of time.
Correct. And there is an air corridor established for example, a lot of radioisotopes come over from Belgium for use in the NHS. And again, the NHS has done a great job making sure that there are expedient ways of dealing with some of those products that have a much shorter shelf life. But you're quite right, time is of the essence, and if you've got a lorry rather held up with refrigerated batches of medicines in them, and they can't get through the port, then some of those medicines may by the time they get into the UK, not be usable.
I think the other thing is that if we've learned through understanding with industry colleagues and working with the NHS that often you need to put together a package of things to have an operation. Unlikely that the drug is the key thing there, but you may well need medical devices, you may well need bandages, equipment, plastic items, all the rest of it. If those don't all arrive at the same time, or the machine that you need is broken down and you need to fix it and you need the part for the machine, quite quickly it's that type of thing that is everyday use in the NHS that could be a challenge. So although we've talked here largely about medicines, your committee may wish to think about this as health in a broader sense, and particularly operations of the NHS in a broader sense.
Well, we've been taking evidence on this for a couple of years, and one of the most vivid quotes I can remember is the Norwegian ambassador to the EU, who told us nothing is in as much of a hurry as a dead fish in the back of a lorry, to illustrate the importance of this. Just in time, can I, with the Chairman's indulgence, ask you one final question? We took evidence last week from trade bodies involving the automotive industry and manufacturing, and they told us that the very talking up of no deal was already a disincentive to investment in the UK. Have you seen any evidence of a disincentive effect on investment of the UK in this Brexit experience in the last year or two?
So, I mean, I spend my time going around and talking up the UK life science sector. We're doing well. We're the clear leader in Europe. The hard thing to work out is if you've got scales, you've got the life science industrial strategy, R&D tax credits, the benefits of the fantastic science base on one side of the scales on an investment decision. That's led to companies like UCB investing in the UK. On the other side, you've got some of the uncertainties around Brexit. I would say talk of no deal adds another weight onto that side of the scales, and is that the one that tips the investment decision against all the excellent work we've been doing for generations in UK life sciences against the UK?
Okay, thank you.
Now, Jonathan, do you want to?
Carry on that
Yeah.
We've been talking about stockpiling. So how much money have your members actually spent on stockpiling and other preparations so far?
The stockpiling in the UK, I think, as I mentioned previously, is paid for by the manufacturers of the medicines. So we provide space and we'll rent it out to them. So actually, our members they have had to find extra space, they have had to find extra properties, and they've been working with the Department of Health to identify those, and some of the extra incremental costs have been paid for, by the Department of Health. But we largely, other than organising it, the costs have been borne by the manufacturing sector. That's deliberate to avoid stockpiling downstream, because the last thing we want is for wholesalers, pharmacies, doctors and patients to stockpile, because then that would generate shortages.
Right.
So the idea is for manufacturers to keep it high up the supply chain, and they are paying for it.
Does anyone...
I don't have a figure from my lot, but in a sense it's a cash flow issue.
Yeah.
Right, so, and in the same way as when you say drugs and chemicals have to be replaced because they have a limited lifespan, again, that's a cash flow issue as a result, but you can't actually quantify the costs.
And that falls very differently for small companies to large companies, and therefore has to be borne in the financial risk element, which is different if you're a major multinational.
Yeah, so working on the back of that, I think it's Mr. Sawyer who said that there could be a problem in October because of Christmas demand, and I think also you said there's going to be a lack of capacity. Would you actually prefer if the October date was delayed? Would it make your life easier?
Well,
there would be. Would there be any extra costs?
Yeah, I mean March through to, just to be, but from the point of view of medicines, March through to September is quite a period of year for capacity. So yes, I mean I think what we're.
So October is a good time for you?
No, sorry. March through to September is a good time. The other times of the year are harder.
Right.
As in October is a challenging time because it's a run up to Christmas, and we get very, very, very full in November, for example. So October is the start of the build for Christmas. So October is a difficult month. Having said that, what our main ask is to at least get to a transition period so we can have some certainty. The challenge for a no deal is all the uncertainty, and we don't know what Plan B is, because we've grown up with the EU for the last, since we've been. The whole system is an integrated system that we'd be pulled off it, and we have no alternative, because business likes certainty, and it's the uncertainty that is the big challenge.
I think what I'm trying to get at is no deal at the end of October viewed as a significant risk, or would you actually prefer it to be pushed back to next March?
I think no deal at any time carries significant risk.
No, we have.
And I think what is clear is that there are a number of devil in the detail questions which are unanswered on some of these points, the data point, the borders point, we have not talked about the flow of people. Any of that will require time. None of these things in our supply chains are simple or easy to change, and all of them would have a lead time within them. So I think we have prepared vigorously and seriously for a no deal, but to an extent we need clarity from government to a level of detail if there is to be the minimisation of the short-term impact, and we're, I hope, also making you aware of some of the long-term downstream impacts of a route that goes in this direction.
I can totally understand your desire to have maximum lead-in times for all of these timetables. However, looking at what's happened in the past on previous extensions, they've happened at the last minute. I don't think it would be an unfair suggestion to say that that might be the same in October if there were to be another extension. That being the case, and understanding the cash flow point and the fact that you're saying warehousing would be better in March than it would be in October, are you therefore of collectively of the view that you prefer it to be in March rather than October?
My view is we prefer not to face a no-deal scenario.
Yeah, no. If there is a no deal scenario.
Well, it's a good question because on the one hand, you know, as a previous member mentioned, there is corporate fatigue at doing this. You know, if we move the goalposts again, you know, we'll actually come next March. You know, what's the preparedness? I think, you know, on the face of it, yes, there'll be more warehouse capacity, but it's about trying to get everybody up to the mark, isn't it? And I think the longer this goes on, then potentially the more critical the situation comes for us, and will we be able to have enough medicines in the UK at whatever time a no deal happens? So,
can I just quickly? I think it's also related to that question. I think it's a matter of uncertainty and investment. You know, projects have been put on hold for a year or 2 years. It's how long those projects can continue to be put on hold for any longer.
Thank you.
Jeremy, do you have one
I did.
final quick point?
Yeah. To Mr. Bates on the MHRA. Given that the EMA is no longer in London, the MHRA is obviously going to have to increase its capacity seriously. Do you not see the opportunity for the MHRA to effectively become the leading national body of its kind within Europe? I'm talking about the continent of Europe here, because it will have to now, rather than subcontract a lot of the work that it would have had to do to the EMA, it will now have to do it itself. Or do you think it's simply going to rubber stamp anything that the EMA does? In other words, are they going to be a serious national regulator, as for instance the national regulator in Canada or the United States is, or will they largely rubber stamp?
So I think that they have been the leading regulator in Europe and have been significant in driving the scientific underpinnings of much of the work of the EMA and the MHRA. From an industry perspective, we'd like to continue in close cooperation with in a European system, whatever type of Brexit happens, and we'd very, very much like to see that. I think the other thing that slightly confuses people is much of this activity remains an MHRA competence. Much of this has not been centralised into Europe. Remember, the EMA was formed in the John Major era, at a time when Europe was very different to now. So, in a sense, there's some differential here between devices and future activities. I think it's good that the government has stepped in to provide some financial support to the MHRA, and that regulatory expertise is not easy to grow. It's scientific capability and people, and it's great that they're continuing to support that. But I think from our perspective, an influential UK scientific powerhouse that has reached beyond our borders and engagement with the EU27 is something that we would like. If that could include a greater community of Switzerland, Israel and others, that would also be fantastic. We've been influential on the global stage as a result of the participation in the EMA. We'd like to see that continue if possible, because we believe there are benefits to EU patients and UK patients, and having a single set of rules harmonised rather than breaking out into more sets of rules. Additional red tape is beneficial to patients and business.
So just as a supplement to that, have you seen an increase in the budget, a permanent increase in the budget for the MHRA, and a permanent increase in the number of staff to recognise that it's going to become a more important?
The MHRA has largely supported itself through fees based on industry fees. There has been a desire to, there's been an understanding that there might be a drop-off of that. I don't think the long-term budget of the parts of the DH that aren't the NHS England are settled yet, and that's something that will be looked at whenever there's a spending review.
But you would want that to be substantially increased to ensure that work.
Maintaining the UK's capability in the regulatory capacity to do novel therapies is part of the UK life science offer and is fundamental alongside our great universities in ensuring the life science sector does very well. We're already leading in Europe. We can do this for the globe, and the regulatory capacity within that is an important part of that. So
taking back control means spending quite a lot more money on that?
Certainly we'll have more costs. Whether there is control, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think more funding is important, because I think because of the removal of the EMA to Holland, I believe the funding to the MHRA decreased because of that. So I think they will require more funding to do that you suggest.
Thank you.
Well, very quick things from me. Reference was made earlier to the leaked government paper from May 2009 that was published in the Financial Times. Have your organisations seen a copy of that document?
No,
I don't
believe so.
No. Okay. And finally, if the new Prime Minister was sitting in this chair in a month's time and you were sitting in front of him, and he said to you, I'm thinking about whether I should take the UK out of the EU on the 31st of October without an agreement. I'm thinking about a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October. Should I do it or not? What answer would you give in one word? Yes or no? Ms Patel? No.
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 Thank you very much indeed. On behalf of the committee, we're very grateful to you for coming today and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us in what is, as we've come to learn as a committee, a very, very complex area, and we know more about how your sectors work than we knew when you walked in the door this morning. Thank you very much. We're now going to move seamlessly to our second panel, so if you'd like to come and take your seats. Order. On behalf of the committee, can I extend a very warm welcome to our witnesses for this second panel this morning, looking at the implications of a no-deal Brexit for the United Kingdom. Can I welcome in particular Vivian Stern, Director for Universities UK International, Dr Beth Thompson, Head of Policy at the Wellcome Trust, and Professor Tim Wheeler, International Director, UK Research and Innovation. Thank you very much for coming. As ever, with this committee, as others, we've got a lot of ground to cover, and as succinct answers to the questions that we're going to put would be much appreciated. Can I begin and ask each of you just to set out in basically a sentence, what is your reaction, what is the view of the organisation that you represent to the prospect of a no-deal Brexit? Mr.
It's a creeping horror that something that...
Sorry, could you say that again?
A creeping horror.
A creeping horror.
That
okay.
Something that we thought might happen by accident might actually now be the deliberate policy of government. I think that sounds to us like a very bad idea.
Okay. Dr Thompson.
even with the best preparation, no deal will leave a vacuum in the UK's relationship with our biggest research partner, and that is something that is untenable and can't be allowed to happen.
Okay, and Professor Wheeler.
Good morning, Chair.
Morning.
A no-deal scenario will be a significant short-term shock to the research and innovation system in the UK, to the people and the funding for that system, to which we in UKRI need to prepare as best as we can.
Okay. Now, given the answers you've just provided to the committee, does it puzzle you that some of the people who want to be the next Prime Minister of this country appear to be contemplating leaving with no deal as a policy for the government that they would lead? Do you think that they don't hear what you're saying? Do you think there are other considerations? Well, why have we got into this situation?
Well, I would say that
Ms. Dunn.
the consensus, it appeared to me, in December or January this year, that the complexities of leaving without a deal made it a really unappealing prospect, that we would do what we could to avoid that. Those calculations or that consensus seems to have changed. And now there seem to be people who are willing to say that leaving without honouring financial obligations, leaving with potentially quite a damaged relationship with the EU partners is a plausible outcome. Now, time passes, and there is therefore an opportunity for everybody to do work that would have been very, very difficult to do in the short period of time that we had, say, between December and March, when this became a real hot topic both in government and for us. And time helps us. But still, my view is that there is now a short-term focus where there really needs to be a long-term focus, that in leaving the European Union, we need to be as mindful of the relationship we want in the long term as we are about the short-term mechanics of the departure itself. And it's disappointing to me personally that the rhetoric seems to have shifted towards this very short-termist discussion about the impact of leaving on a specific date or otherwise.
If I can perhaps pick up from there, I would agree. I can't answer that question about why our messages haven't been heard, but I think the research community as a whole is very clear that a no deal would be very damaging, both, as Vivian says, because of the short-term impacts that would have, and Tim mentioned this too, but also because of that, the difficulty, or the fact that no deal will fracture our relationship with the EU in a way that is going to be very difficult to come back from. And therefore, the kind of agreement that we would need on research in the future in terms of the movement of people and researchers, research regulation and also funding will be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve in a no-deal scenario. And I think there has been this short-termist focus on how could we manage and mitigate the short-term impacts of no deal, which would be difficult and challenging and create an immediate shock and some uncertainty, but without enough consideration to the long-term damage that will do. And I find it deeply concerning that we're in a situation that we're having to consider this.
Professor Wheeler.
So for those who are part of the UK's research and innovation system, I think they will be fully aware of the potential risks of a no-deal scenario. For those who are taking a more distant view, then they may well know that the UK is a world-leading research and innovation nation. However, I think some of the subtleties of funding processes from the European Commission, some of the issues about the movement of academic staff and students won't be well known to that constituency. And so it is our job, I think, to make them more aware of the potential risks and the sort of mitigation actions that an organisation like UKRI can then take to address those by the date of EU exit.
Do you think that the ministers with whom you have talked understand the implications that you've referred to in your evidence thus far?
So, if I speak first,
please.
In terms of the minister who we most frequently have contact with, as you would expect, that's Minister Chris Skidmore. Yeah. He and his officials are fully aware of the details and the broad issues at play here. And in UKRI, we are working very closely with his officials on a day-to-day basis in the work and responsibilities that we have to undertake.
I would agree with that in that I think that Minister Skidmore and his officials do understand these issues. The challenge, I think, is that Brexit is an issue that spans multiple departments, and therefore it's less clear whether there's that same level of understanding and join-up across other departments.
And I'd also agree. I think we have a good minister in Chris Skidmore, and actually his officials have been working very hard on the mitigating the consequences of a no-deal Brexit and very collaboratively. So I've got nothing but praise for them, actually.
What do you think the referendum result and the last 3 years have done to Britain's reputation in the fields in which you and your organisations work? When people look at us, what do they say?
So, I mean, there's clearly mixed views out there, and we, in a sense, spend a lot of time talking with those in the UK community, but also the Brussels-based counterparts in other research agencies. I think it's fair to say there's often a perception that this is the UK's research and innovation expertise shrinking into itself, so it's not looking out in the way that it used to. And an important part of UKRI's role in its Brussels-based offices is actually to counter that, to give information where we can, that there are both community events and underwrite funding processes that I'm sure we'll get on to that we are undertaking to try to mitigate these risks. But there will always be the perception from some that this is, in a sense, the UK science and innovation community moving away from their European counterparts in some way.
I think from our perspective at Wellcome, there is no doubt that the UK is a brilliant environment for science. We have world-leading science and research in this country, and that should be celebrated. And I don't think researchers elsewhere in the world or policymakers elsewhere in the world have yet seen an impact on that research base. I think the concerns that we see are from researchers from other EU countries, perhaps even from other parts of the world, who now look at the UK and say, is this the kind of country that I want to come and live and work in? There is, I think, some people see it as a challenge to UK values, and I think that is that now, as an immigrant to the UK, they wouldn't be welcome. That's not necessarily backed up by statistics that show that actually, generally, the UK public are really supportive of researchers coming in to work in the UK. But I think there is some sense and some reluctance, and we've heard that from some of our centres and institutes that they are struggling, particularly at more junior levels, to recruit as many EU nationals as they once did. And clearly that is not an impact of anything that has happened as a result of Brexit in terms of changes in law or the immigration system. It's about how people feel about coming to work here. And the uncertainty in terms of what the future funding arrangements look like are also affecting researchers' decisions, because they want to come and work in a place where, as an aspiring young researcher, you want to be able to apply for a European Research Council grant because they're one of the best grants available anywhere in the world. And if you don't know if after the 31st of October you can apply for that grant, you are inevitably going to feel worried about coming to the UK. And we certainly have some people who were offered Wellcome funding and afterwards said, actually, you know what, I'm not going to take your funding, I'm going to go to Germany and set up a lab instead because I know I can apply for European Research Council funding there. So it is having an impact.
I think just to add to that, I think there have been phases in the sort of conversations we've had with our European counterparts from the early days post-referendum, where there was this enormous spirit of solidarity, and the sort of main message that we got everywhere we went was, look, the UK research and education system is outstandingly strong, we want to continue to work with it, we'll find a way, we'll be at your side, you know, we can do this. And I think that fundamentally that attitude is still there. But, you know, predominantly I would say now when I'm talking to counterparts across Europe, the sort of major emotion expressed is one of pity, and I don't really like that. I was in Iceland recently talking to the head of their research funding agency, and we had a kind of good conversation about the government underwrite and and the statements the government have made about preserving relationships. But at the end of the meeting, on our way out, he turned to me and he said, you know, I feel rather sorry for you because you're representing what most people would acknowledge to be one of the best university and research systems in the world. And here you are, presumably going around Europe a bit like a travelling salesperson. And, you know, we've had such influence based on people's respect for our system that I think we have to really think about how we can preserve the fundamental strength of our university and research system so that we don't end up being an object of pity as we lose ground from a position of previous prestige. And that, I think, has to be a challenge both for domestic policy and our future UK-EU relationship.
Okay, thank you very much.
Come on this point. I heard that one way that research institutes are looking to still get into the EU funding stream is to do joint projects with EU universities. I mean, is that true? Is it happening? Is it a valid way to go forward in the future? And do we have the contacts with the EU universities that we need to do it?
Yeah, I mean, our universities are phenomenally networked. So those sort of partnerships, those strategic partnerships exist already. But we've seen in the last couple of years lots of universities setting up a physical presence in Europe, a new sort of deeper strategic partnership that might go beyond what was there before. Yeah. And I think the concept behind that is finding ways to ensure that, you know, whatever sort of Brexit we get, there will be a route to continue to collaborate on European projects. The mechanics of that aren't entirely clear to me, because if you have, I mean, look, take for example, King's has a partnership with, I think it's TU Dresden, but it's focused on clinical medicine. If you think about the breadth of research that King's would undertake with European partners, it sort of seems to me that that initiative is pretty narrow and might help in one discipline, but what will it do for the broader relationship? And I think that's replicated in other fields. So lots of these strategic partnerships have quite a narrow focus. An exception to that might be the Oxford-Berlin partnership, which does seem to me quite broad-based. But if you look what's actually going on, those institutions are contributing to a common pot, so they can run workshops together, so they can pump prime new research relationships. It's not an alternative to being able to draw on big European research funds. So I suspect it's going to be helpful, whatever kind of Brexit we get, but it won't be a solution.
Thank you.
Okay, Stephen Tibbs.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to ask one very specific question to ask each of you whether you know of specific impacts in the area that you're interested in if the UK was to leave the EU without a data adequacy determination on the part of the Commission.
Yes, so the challenge if we leave with no deal, that immediately as a third country, the UK won't have an arrangement in place to enable the free flow of data between the UK and the EU. So at the moment, because we're a member state, we have that free flow. And as you're saying, it is possible to agree an adequacy deal that enables that free flow to continue between the EU and a third country. But leaving without a deal, we wouldn't have adequacy immediately. It would be likely to take some time to get there. And the other options, there are other options to legitimise your data flows between the EU and a third country, but they are bureaucratic and difficult to put in place. They often require, for example, additional legal clauses. And particularly for the academic research community, where there aren't extensive regulatory support within universities to be helping with large levels of paperwork, any additional bureaucracy that you as a researcher are going to have to go through in order to transfer your data is going to make your day-to-day life more difficult. So I think a good example of this is the 1958 birth cohort. At the moment, that's a brilliant research resource that we have in the UK. It's collected data on thousands of people, and that data is shared between the UK and the EU, and we see about 2,500 data transfers from the UK to the EU each year. The data then comes back once the EU researchers have done their work on it to enrich that resource so it gets better for everyone. That's the kind of thing where the personal data is flowing, researchers are going to have to do much more paperwork for it to get through, and that's going to be more costly and bureaucratic.
If I could just add to that. So one of the things that we've done to try and help universities deal with this problem is develop model clauses that they can use in these contracts. And this probably falls into the category of no-deal planning, where you can, over time, if you've got the time, start to mitigate some of these problems. It has a cost, obviously, so that's probably, in the case of a large university, hundreds, if not thousands, of individual contracts that need to be scrutinised and then renegotiated. And that, of course, has a cost and will take time. But it is fixable. And I think universities are, by and large, doing it. One of the problems I think we've had is that my sense is that for many universities, they don't really know whether they should go at this or not. You know, up until March, you still found universities that said, look, it's never going to happen. We're not going to get a no deal. So thank you for all the kind of work you've done to tell us what we would need to do if this did happen, but we're just going to hold our fire. Now, we don't yet know whether we should be saying to universities, guys, invoke your no deal plans. Do this stuff we said you might have to do. And that, I'm sure, is true of lots of other parts of the sector.
If I can perhaps just add one more example, because Beth has outlined the issue very well there. For UKRI, the main areas of risk on this basis is within the clinical trials support. MRC, Medical Research Council, in UKRI has been working with its clinical trials unit at King's College London in order to try to prepare together for the situation where the data adequacy issues have to be negotiated post-exit.
And what would it require to overcome the problem?
So my understanding is it will require negotiations on a case-by-case basis, individual contract by individual contract.
And I think an important element to that is that it's not just something the UK can always do unilaterally. So that has to be a negotiation with the EU partner. And part of the problem is when UK researchers want to get their hands on personal data from the EU, and there it's the EU, the burden is on the EU researcher, and I think that's a real challenge.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. We've touched on this a bit already, but I wanted to ask you a bit more about the impact of no deal on staffing in universities. And of course, I'm not talking just about the academic staff. I'm thinking particularly about postdocs, lab researchers. I mean, I've got Heriot Watt and Napier in my constituency, and senior staff have spoken to me there about their concerns about postdocs often earn considerably less than the limit on a Tier 2 visa, but are absolutely vital to research work ongoing, particularly in science and STEM subjects, but also in language subjects as well. So I'm interested in your view of the impact a no-deal Brexit would have on staffing levels in the university, taking into account those figures.
Well, perhaps I can start. I think that you're right. It's that early career researcher and technician type role that is most likely to be affected by the proposed 30,000 salary threshold. We've argued that that threshold should be reduced to 21,000, and we think that would deal with the majority of the issues in our sector. But it is something that I think the government needs to give serious consideration to, because labs don't run if you don't have technicians. And the pipeline of early career researchers is incredibly important to the UK. We've got a national ambition to invest 2.4% of GDP in research and development. If you want to do that, you need to have a research workforce that is capable of, absorbing that investment or that, or meeting that ambition. If we want that, we cannot afford to stop the flow of overseas research talent to the UK. I mean, that would be a very, very bad thing to do.
So, I think underpinning this issue is that this is a highly specialist and highly mobile community internationally. We know that perhaps within the academic community in the UK, 1 in 6 individuals are from other parts of Europe. And we equally know that people move around frequently from the UK outwards and inwards. So where there are barriers to settling into a new position in the new country, possibly with a family as well, then these individuals will have choices elsewhere. in where they set up their academic or research careers. So very much support those words that Vivian has said. Research technicians and the specialist staff that support research are absolutely critical, and those that potentially could fall below this 30k proposed cap.
So we likewise have concerns about the £30,000 cap. If you look at somewhere like the Francis Crick Institute, which is one of the institutes that we fund in central London, around 25% of their technician staff are non-UK EU nationals. And the £30,000 cap is a real worry, and like Universities UK, we would, our analysis suggests that a threshold of around £21,000 would avoid some of those problems. There are also significant issues in the way the rest of the UK visa system works in terms of the cost. So even for those, for example, the 55% of postdocs at the Crick Institute who are likely to be over that salary threshold but who come from the EU, the visa costs for the UK compared to somewhere like France, there's something like a tenfold difference in those. So I think we have to do all we can to be attractive as the UK as a destination for these researchers. So it's partly about getting the immigration system right. In the longer term, assuming we get a deal, potentially in a no deal, looking to negotiate reciprocal movement with the EU for researchers would also be a massive benefit to get around some of those other problems.
I mean, earlier when the Chair was asking you questions, Dr. Thompson, you mentioned an example of somebody turning down an offer of Wellcome Trust-funded research position in the United Kingdom because of fears about the consequences of Brexit. Now, likewise, I'm hearing examples from professors at Napier University of people not wanting to come to a position at Napier because they're afraid to come to the United Kingdom. I wonder if any of you are aware of any actual research and statistics on this rate of reluctance to come here even in the period before Brexit actually happens. One hears a lot of anecdotal evidence. I hear other colleagues talking about it in committee and at chambers, but in the Chamber of the House of Commons, but I wonder if anyone's done any research into the already existing rate of people not wanting to come to the UK because of the current climate on immigration and Brexit.
So we have some stats in terms of Wellcome's funding. We've seen a 20% drop in early career researchers applying for our funding schemes in the last year. And that's been consistent. I think actually it went up from about 14% in 2017. At the Wellcome Sanger Institute, they saw nearly a 50% drop in applications from EU nationals for their PhD studentships. That was in 2017. So we have, it's not perfect data, but we have a few snapshots.
Can I add perhaps an additional point of evidence? It's very hard to take a holistic view of anecdotal evidence, but like you, we've heard examples. The example that I have is from the Higher Education Statistics Agency. Their figures for postgraduate research starters and those from other parts of Europe declined by 4% for those enrolled in 17-18, beg your pardon, compared to those who applied and enrolled in 15-16. So, I mean, this is emerging evidence, this is aggregate evidence, but it is quite hard to get numbers that are across the sector as a whole.
What about people who are EU nationals who are already here and are leaving? I mean, I'm interested in, have you got any statistical evidence about people leaving as a result of the impact of the fear of an impending Brexit, whether it's deal or no deal? And also whether you feel that the government's current reassurances on settled status are sufficient to prevent European Union nationals who are staff in universities or scientists, research scientists, from leaving the UK?
So I don't have any, I don't think I have the evidence you're looking for, so I don't have a number for the sector as a whole. I only have some examples where people have reported that they found other positions as a result of uncertainties, potentially from a no-deal exit. But individuals will make decisions on a range of basis important to themselves, but I'm afraid I don't have the evidence for the sector.
Perhaps I could just add, the last time I looked at these figures, and I'd have to write to the committee with the data because I don't have it to hand, the net effect was actually pretty stable. That yes, there were EU nationals leaving, but actually recruitment was also relatively buoyant. Those figures were produced by UCEA, the Universities and Colleges Employers Association, and I could take back the request to update the committee on the latest figures. I was also recently at a conference hosted by the University Human Resource Association, and I asked that organisation whether they felt that net they were losing more staff than they were gaining. And broadly speaking, the response was, yes, people are deciding to go, but we're still managing to successfully recruit. But they also offered to do the kind of thing which I think you're suggesting is necessary, which is provide a more up-to-date and timely picture than the HESA data is able to give us, because the HESA data is lagging by quite some extent.
What about the government's current reassurances on settled status? Do you think that those are sufficient to encourage EU nationals to stay in the UK, or is there a problem with the level of reassurance that's been provided so far?
So I think the settled status scheme apparently seems to be working reasonably well. I haven't heard very many complaints other than very early on about the process for applying for settled status. Our bigger concern is about the proposals the government's made about European temporary leave to remain in the event of a no-deal Brexit. And we are deeply unhappy with the suggestion that European temporary leave to remain would be restricted to 3 years, because people arriving under that arrangement wouldn't necessarily have the confidence that at the end of that period they'd be able to secure a visa. And if you're coming to do a PhD or any programme in Scotland which might last longer than 3 years, it's pretty unappealing if you're saying, come, trust us, you can apply for European temporary leave to remain, but we cannot at this point guarantee you that you'll get a visa at the end of the process.
Because of course in Scotland the standard honours degree is 4 years
Exactly
long.
so.
So that appears to have been overlooked by the British government at present.
Well, I would say the British government is well aware that the standard undergraduate programme in Scotland is 4 years, so it is quite surprising that they haven't managed to create a system that accommodates that. But
thank you.
Okay. Just on that point, is it your view that the government needs to do more to make it crystal clear to all EU citizens who are in the UK at the point we leave, with or without a deal, that they will be able to stay and get settled status? Do you think there's still uncertainty in the event, say, there was a no-deal Brexit? Because this committee has disagreed on some things, but one thing on which we've united is that the UK government should give a clear and categorical commitment in all circumstances that EU citizens will be able to stay and get their settled status. Do you think there's doubt in the minds of the staff from the EU who are working or thinking of coming about what might happen?
I think that the problem is there is so much uncertainty about absolutely everything that even if a university is able to give a very clear and unequivocal message to staff who are already here that the settled status scheme is open, they can apply now, they should be applying now, even if that message is relatively straightforward and quite reassuring, the kind of maelstrom of uncertainty about everything else, I think, undermines the confidence that they might have in that message. So there's sort of two levels. On one hand, no, I think the settled status scheme should be reasonably reassuring. On the other hand, if I was an EU national, would I feel pretty uncertain? Yes, I certainly would.
Okay. Now, Vera Hobhouse.
So I'm in close contact with both, and we've got two successful universities in Bath, Bath Spa and the University of Bath. I'm in close contact with both of the Vice-Chancellor and the Principal of Bath Spa, and they both feel very threatened overall about the university funding situation. So there's a consultation out about humanities sort of possibly getting lower tuition fees from students, but also demographically, I understand in the UK student numbers are falling. They might be picking up again in 5-6 years' time. And then the threat of Brexit sort of create basically a perfect storm and a very challenging funding situation for certainly my universities as I understand it. So what capacity is actually there for universities to sort of go further afield and compensate with overseas students to compensate for EU students that we might not be attracting go further afield, is there actually a sort of projection that we can actually do a lot better and go further afield and compensate in that way, or is there no evidence for that?
I think we can certainly do better on international student recruitment. In fact, you know, there is an opportunity right now before Parliament to make a change that would make a huge difference to our fortunes in attracting international students. We currently have what I would regard as an uncompetitive visa offer for international students. If you are choosing between the US, Canada, Australia and the UK, which is typically, you know, the most popular study destinations, each of our competitors offers an opportunity to stay and work for a period after graduation. We don't really. There is an amendment to the immigration bill, which is standing in Joe Johnson and Paul Blomfield's name, which would correct that problem. If that change were made, I think you would see a really dramatic shift in UK overseas recruitment. We also have a government target to recruit 600,000 international students by 2030. You know, I'd like them to be more ambitious, but I think it's brilliant that the government has now committed explicitly to growth. We will need to do everything we can to attract students from outside Europe if we see an impact on European recruitment as a consequence of Brexit. But I think my note of caution is this. First of all, it's not just about numbers, it's also about quality. And we've got some absolutely outstanding European students, particularly at postgraduate level, and postgraduate research students from Europe are a very important part of our research infrastructure. Secondly, I think it's important that we have balanced classrooms, so we have a diverse range of students in our universities. And those of you who have universities in your constituencies will probably be familiar with some of the anxieties around overdependence on a very small number of places for international student recruitment. And China is the biggest single source country. Europe is responsible for a third currently of our international student recruitment. So I don't think it is okay to say, forget about Europe, we'll lose those students, no problem, we'll go and find them from elsewhere. I think we both have to invest in reassuring EU students that they'll be able to come and study in the UK and make ourselves more attractive internationally.
Anybody else want to comment?
So I think the part of Bath University's priorities that fall under UKRI will be more the research funding and the research funding that they gain through the European Framework Programmes, currently the Horizon 2020 programme. And there they are looking at potentially a situation in a no-deal scenario where we no longer have access to a major source of funding from the European Commission. On aggregate, the UK, or all UK organisations, win about €1 billion per year from this programme, so it is huge. And I think it's fair to say that UKRI's major activity in preparing for a no-deal scenario has been to deliver the government's underwrite guarantee and underwrite guarantee extension to replace, as far as possible, those research fundings from a UK domestic source.
So can I just continue, because it is hugely important for the University of Bath. So when you say the government is sort of endeavouring to underwrite that, so what are there absolute 100% certainties, or does that also sort of depend on the political climate and possibly, you know, the budget, and is the Treasury already fully committed to that?
So it's a complex scheme because it's a large scheme, but it has two broad elements. For those projects where UK organisations are currently successful in securing funding from Horizon 2020 and up to the day of EU exit, then the underwrite guarantee is there to replace that funding from the point of EU exit onwards. And UKRI has been commissioned to deliver that underwrite. The underwrite guarantee then goes from the point of EU exit to the end of the Horizon 2020 programme at the end of 2020. And there that guarantee covers funding for all of those programmes where the UK can continue to receive funding as essentially a third country rather than a member state. And again, UKRI's main task has been to organise the delivery of both those two elements, the underwrite guarantee and the underwrite guarantee extension.
Just one last quick question,
Okay.
sir. But anything beyond Horizon 2020, because that's actually running out quite soon,
Yeah.
where university had been expecting that, you know, the follow-up program to Horizon 2020, there might be able to bid into that and continue to get the funding that way, that's all finished, and there's no further underwriting guarantees, is that what you're saying?
So those particular underwrites end at the end of the Horizon 2020 programme, at the end of 2020. The subsequent programme is termed Horizon Europe, will run for a 7-year period from the beginning of 2021. And that is at advanced planning stage in the EU. The UK's preferred option is to seek full association to the Horizon Europe programme, which would give us the same access to that funding as if we were a member state, so it will give us an associated country status. Those are not resolved yet, both the final plans to that Horizon Europe programme, but also the question of full association is something that is not yet finalised.
But surely a no-deal Brexit would threaten that sort of cooperation in a big way, wouldn't it?
So there's no reason why in a no-deal Brexit the UK can't still seek association to Horizon Europe, but there will be much larger relationship issues between the UK and the EU that may well influence that as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, Jeremy Lefroy, I think you wanted to come in, and John Whittingham does next. Jeremy.
Yes, certainly. Firstly, if I can just continue on research funding, you said that the UK universities gain approximately €1 billion a year. Is that right?
Correct.
And so your understanding is that that has been guaranteed, but only for the short term.
So for those awards that are currently underway and those that are deemed successful at the point of EU exit, those fall under this underwrite guarantee. And UKRI has been tasked with delivering that, and that, in a sense, has been our main no-deal preparation activity to date.
Now, it was my understanding during the referendum campaign that people campaigning for leave would say that we would be able to continue to provide the same level of research funding out of what we would save on our contributions to the European Union. Have you heard government now saying, well, going forward, we're going to make sure that whatever happens, we are going to have at least the same level, if not more, in terms of research funding available for UK universities so that they can maintain and increase their research effort?
So it's a complex issue. I mean, there's perhaps three short points. Traditionally, UK research and innovation organisations have won back more through these competitive programmes than, broadly speaking, the UK contributes, although it's very difficult to calculate that. What the underwrite guarantee seeks to do is to replace funding that's already been won by UK organisations up to the point of EU exit, and to guarantee to cover those that may be won for most of the schemes in the remaining year or so of the Horizon 2020 programme. Now, beyond that, I think it becomes less certain. So the terms of association to Horizon Europe, so from 2021 onwards, are not yet finalised and won't be finalised until after the point of EU exit as it currently stands. So those negotiations are yet to be had. BEIS undertake those negotiations, and we provide evidence to them as part of that process.
Please, sorry, and I should have declared I'm a member of a board of a university in the UK. So, yeah.
Do you mind if I add a supplementary point to that? So Tim has talked about the underwrite, and he's mentioned that for the part of the underwrite that applies to us bidding for things that aren't already, the grants we haven't already secured. There are some things we can participate in under the current rules as a third country, and then there are some very significant things that we will not be able to access as a third country after the date of exit. It so happens those include the European Research Council. Now, what we haven't heard clearly from government, from I think either ministers or from officials, is that funding will be made available to replace the bits of the programme we can't access as a third country, the ERC and the Marie Curie Slodowska actions. If we had left in March and we had not been able to access those funding sources, the loss to the UK, based on our previous success, would have been about 1.3 billion just for the end of this bit of programme. So that money has never been guaranteed. So I think whilst the government's underwrite for Horizon 2020 is exceptionally useful, there are still some very, very big unresolved issues. The other thing I would say is that we have now got to start thinking about the next programme. We may not be in a position to negotiate association to Horizon Europe, the next programme, in a timely manner. You know, that's starting in 2021. We should be having those negotiations now. This political circumstance means, as Tim said, I think it's unlikely we're going to do that. So the government's going to have to think about, in my view, extending the guarantees they've already offered to say to European partners, if you want a UK university in your consortium for Horizon Europe bid, one of the ones for the next programme, we'll put the money on the table, it's there. Nobody has said that so far. So those consortia which are starting to form to make applications under the new programme, they don't know whether the UK funding will be available. So I think it's really important the government is more explicit about how they will support our participation in those bits we can take part in, and what they'll do to replace those bits we can't take part in, because the sum of money is enormous and the loss to the research system would be enormous.
And have you said that to the government clearly?
Yes, we have.
Okay. And just one final question.
Thompson wants this.
Sorry. Yeah.
Vivian has picked up, I think, a really important short-term point that I'm very glad that we've covered about the European Research Council. But I also wanted to come back to this issue about association to Horizon Europe in the longer term. Because you're right that there have been indications that perhaps we could replace the money that it would take to associate to Horizon Europe with money that we can do something domestically with. And I think it's very important to flag two things here. Firstly, that it's not simply a case of substituting cash from one place to another. The EU programmes are very successful, they're world leading, they provide us with a great opportunity as the UK to network with other researchers. And so therefore we can't just be looking at like for like cash, we have to look at the other values that you get from those programmes. So seeking association will be really important. But the second thing that I wanted to say about that is that I don't think we should underestimate the difficulty of doing that in a no-deal situation. Yes, technically it should be possible. There are third countries that do have associated country status, but I think politically it would be hugely difficult to associate in a no-deal to secure that long-term agreement.
Okay. And the final point I wanted to ask, clearly one of if you like, the criticisms that has been levelled at, perhaps unfairly, a lot of the time at UK universities, particularly if you like the upper rank of UK universities, is they're quite happy to engage in partnerships overseas, right across the world. I mentioned Berlin, Oxford and Berlin. But when it comes to actually investing in the UK, in other parts other than their home city, they're a little more reluctant. They may have some outreach programs here and there trying to get increased diversity among their student population, but when it comes to hard facts on the ground in terms of putting shall we say, an Oxford University in Bolton, a small campus there to help regenerate other parts of the country, we are lacking. I have seen a different approach in both from other UK universities, where they do seek to go into nearby towns which perhaps are not so well served by higher education, to really help to get involved in there, both in terms of education and helping start small businesses and so on. And I've seen that in other countries as well. But I wondered whether you saw a greater appetite from our leading universities to invest in the UK outside their traditional locations, so as to bring the UK together.
Perhaps I could take that question. I mean, I think there's a false dichotomy between universities that see themselves as global institutions, globally engaged in research and education, and institutions that are somehow local in their mission. If you look at any of our big research-intensive civic universities, they will be spending probably millions of pounds on outreach to students from disadvantaged groups or groups that don't traditionally go to university. They will be investing in a significant programme of public engagement to make sure that the research that they're undertaking, the knowledge that they're generating is available to communities, not just local but national. They're one of the major parts of our nationwide museum infrastructure, for example. And Lord Kerslake has recently chaired a commission which looked at civic engagement on the part of universities. And I think that, for me anyway, and it's not really my policy topic of expertise, the contribution that universities make to the fabric of society is something that we should be really genuinely proud of. And that's before you start thinking about the economic impact of those global relationships. So you think about the fact that the international students that universities recruit contribute £26 billion to the UK economy, not just in terms of what they give to universities, but the kind of money they spend in taxi firms and small businesses and through the spending of their family and friends when they come to visit as tourists. And then you think about the kind of companies who've decided to bring foreign direct investment to the UK because they've got a research relationship with the university. And I could send the committee, if you like, I've been compiling a list of these companies who are setting up here because the University of Exeter has a particular expertise, or the University of Glasgow has particular expertise. And, so there is no distinction in my mind between a university that is making a national contribution and a university that is globally connected. They're these bridges, and they're so fundamentally important in our economic fabric. I think we could do a much better job of explaining it, possibly.
Thank you very much.
I would just make the point that in my town, a university pulled out, a British university, Staffordshire University, pulled out of an entire campus. That campus is still there. It's been invested in, and I welcome that, by a Chinese consortium, but there was no UK university that was prepared to come in and step in and take over an existing UK campus, which I found a little bit disappointing, given that they were prepared to invest all over the world.
Well, I think, we heard a little bit earlier that there are a number of policy and other factors that are putting quite a lot of financial pressure on institutions. I mean, there's the demographic issue which you mentioned. There are rising pension costs. There is, some uncertainty about future income for tuition as a result of the Auger review. There are rising costs across the board associated not just with BrExit, but generally speaking, to do with economic conditions. So institutions cannot afford to get into financial, the kind of financial difficulty that might cause a collapse, because frankly, they are in many cases too important to local communities to fail. And that sometimes means retrenching, doing things that might be really unpopular in terms of cutting provision, but they have to balance their finances at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you very much. John Whittingdale.
Thank you. Mr. Stern, I'm sure you would agree that the principal reason why so many students from overseas wish to come and study in the UK is because we have some of the finest universities in the world. You said we cannot abandon the third of students from the EU and hope to make it up from the 2/3 of students who don't come from the EU. What I don't understand is, why is it that the 2/3 of students who don't come from the EU have the confidence to do so because they want to study here without an arrangement which has been reached through the European Union, but the EU students who seem to think won't want to come and study here without that arrangement continuing?
So I personally don't believe that we will see a total collapse in EU recruitment post-Brexit, even if, and we don't know yet, the fee is the same as international fees and we have an immigration regime. I'm perhaps more optimistic than some other commentators. So, for example, Oxford Economics did an analysis and they suggested that as much as 57% of EU students might decide to go elsewhere if we went to international fee status. I think I'm probably a bit more optimistic than that.
Do you know on what basis they produced that figure?
So you can model behaviour based on previous policy changes. So, for example, we know that EU students are quite price sensitive because we've changed our fee regime for EU students on 2 occasions in the last 15 years or so. And you can see what the effect of moving from a fee-free regime to initially the 1,000 and then the 3,000 and then the 9,000 fee regime would be. So you can sort of extrapolate that. And we also know things like what proportion of students from different countries take advantage of our loan offer. So it's generally speaking the case that the richer Northern European countries draw less on the loan system that we offer than, for example, the EU13. So you can then begin to try to make some judgments about what you think the impact of a change will be. But I would argue, and it's my job to promote the university sector around the world, including as a study destination, that we can also make our own weather. I mean, you are right to say, fundamentally, when people choose where to study, the thing that matters is the quality of the education that they're offered. And I believe we've got a very strong offer. We also, I think, have a strong offer on graduate outcomes. We're about to publish a lovely piece of research on this, showing that there is genuinely a wage premium for those people who study in the UK compared to people who study in other systems. So we can do a lot to mitigate the potential impact of that change, but there will be an impact. And it may be short term, it may be lower than Oxford Economics thinks, but there will be an impact. And I can tell you some universities have modelled what I would regard as quite catastrophic decreases in EU enrolments, up to 80%. And when you work that through to the bottom line, that means closing courses and pulling back from the kind of things that we were talking about just a moment ago.
But as you say, the modelling is based on assumptions about what we may choose to do. I mean, if we choose to charge EU students a full overseas fee, which currently they don't have to pay, then yes, I'm sure some will decide not to come here. And equally, in terms of eligibility for student loans. But all these are things within our own gift.
Yeah.
So the models are just assuming that the British government or the British universities will adopt a policy which is going to lead to a disastrous fall in their intake, which seems rather unlikely.
Well, it's an extremely important point, actually. We talked about uncertainty and other things. Our government only announced the fee that EU students will pay if they start in September 2020 about 3 or 4 weeks ago. We're about halfway through the recruitment cycle for 2020. You know, there are students who are now beginning the thinking about studying in 2021 who don't know whether it's going to be a UK fee, whether they can access the loan, or whether it's going to be an international fee. And my prediction, based on the last 3 years, is that we will get an announcement on fee status somewhere like halfway through the next recruitment cycle. And it will be late, and I'll have emails from Greek counsellors sending me impassioned pleas. Here I am standing in a recruitment fair. Students are asking me what the fee is, and I can't tell them the answer. What are you going to do about it? That's where we're going to be this time next year. I just bet it. And it's a real shame, because those students, in the meantime, they know they can study at relatively high quality and lower cost institutions in Germany, France, the Netherlands, often in English. So we have got competition. It's not that we can just assume that people will come to us because they've got no other choice. So the government should be clear as soon as possible what the fee regime for 2021 will be, and then we can deal with the facts as they are.
Is there anything stopping a British university saying to a new entrant coming in, let's say this September, that we, the university, will guarantee that you will pay the same level of fees as you are currently doing until you complete your course?
They don't need to, because the policy right across the UK is that any student entering in 2019 will pay the UK level fee and have access to finance for the duration of their course. So no university has to do anything additional to that.
So why is there any uncertainty about people making applications?
So they're now applying for 2020. We have an announcement for that. Very soon they're going to be applying for it. They're going to be thinking about 2021.
But you could extend that guarantee if you chose to those students.
The government could. The question of whether universities could say to European students that we will discriminate in your favour in setting the fee is a question that we've actually sought legal advice on a couple of occasions. And it's our understanding that you can do it at the moment because UK law says you can. Now, we're also assuming that that law is likely to change post-Exit. So the law that allows us to discriminate in favour of EU students would have to be changed. But if it were changed, then it would leave any university that would say to a French student, your fee will be 9,000, but to a Japanese student, it's going to be 15 or 16,000. They'd be vulnerable to legal challenge. So it's a question for the government. And like everything in this space, it's something that, you know, the sooner the decisions are made in some respects, the better.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Jonathan, did you want to?
No, I think I'm covered.
You've been covered. Well, thank you very much. One final question from me. Just ask you to imagine that the new Prime Minister, whoever it is sitting in this chair in a month's time and puts to you a very simple question on weighing up whether we should leave the EU on the 31st of October with a deal or without a deal. And that person asks, should I leave without a deal? In one word, what answer or advice would you give them?
No.
No.
We are prepared for either.
You're prepared for either. Okay. All right. Can I thank you on behalf of the committee very much indeed for coming today. Your evidence has been really useful and we're very grateful. Order, order.